Let's sing. God, you've given so much to me. I don't want to keep it inside. Help me share it with my friends, because your love is too big to hide.
Hello there, it's Pastor Carol here again, and I'm going to just give you an update on our Climate Sunday service that we had last Sunday, to bring you the reading, which is from Genesis 6, and the message that we recorded outside last Sunday. So here's our reading to begin with, and I'm reading from a version called The Voice. Genesis 6, 8 to 22. There was one person whom the Lord could not let go of, Noah, because this man pleased him. Here is the account of Noah and his descendants. Noah was a good man, a right living man, the best of his generation, and he walked closely with God. Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They lived at a time when the world had become vile and corrupt. Violence was everywhere. God saw that the earth was in ruins, and he knew why. All people on earth except Noah had lived corrupt lives and ruined God's plans for them. So he had to do something. So God spoke to Noah. Noah, I have decided to wipe out all the living creatures I have made, because they are spreading violence throughout the earth. Watch, I will destroy them with the earth. But I want you to build an ark. Build it out of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with tar. Here's how you will do it. Build the ark 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Put a roof on the ark and leave a gap of 18 inches below the roof line for air to circulate. Put the door of the ark on its side and build it with lower, middle, and upper decks. Look, I am going to unleash a torrent and flood the earth to destroy all flesh under the heavens, which breathes the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth will die. But I will make a pact with you, Noah, a covenant agreement. To survive, you and your family, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives must go into the ark. And out of all the living creatures I have made, you must bring 2 of each kind into the ark with you, to keep them alive. Bring 1 male and 1 female of each kind. Bring all kinds of birds, all sorts of animals, and all varieties of creatures that creep upon the ground in pairs, so that each species will survive. Also you must bring food with you. Bring every kind of food which may be eaten, and store it all inside the ark. That way, you and all the creatures will have enough to eat. So Noah listened to God, and he built the ark, and he did everything God asked him to do. So just to introduce the message, the story of Noah and the ark is one that most of us have heard from childhood, and maybe it's one we don't think about very much in everyday life. Maybe it's one that just seems a bit too far-fetched to have relevance in the 21st century. But we're going to swap to the message as it was broadcast outside now, and so you can pick it up from there. It's a story that has been told in various formats throughout the part of the world that's known as Mesopotamia. And although we think of it as a Christian story, it's not actually unique to Christianity. It's found in various different religious traditions for that area. We think that there's some basis for the flood having happened, that is in the geology of the land. But quite apart from that, it speaks very deeply into the meaning of life, the question of addressing the evil ways of the earth and the need for fresh beginnings. And for us, in our Christian tradition, it also speaks of the special relationship that there is between God and man. And this relationship involving this thing we call a covenant, a promise that was made by God and reciprocated by man. But does it actually have any relevance for today? If we look into the story and we think about the questions and the pictures that we've looked at already, we might notice some similarities and maybe some definite differences between the great flood that caused Noah to build the ark and the catastrophic climate changes that urgently threaten our world. So we're going to have a look, if the weather holds off, at just a few of them. So let's think first of all about this question of the wickedness of the world. In the ancient writings, the problem of increasing wickedness in the world and how to solve it are linked with those stories of the impending flood and a resetting of world order. And actually, in that way, the biblical version is the same. We find a God who is concerned about the wicked state of the world he's created and how to address it. And we find a God who, although at the beginning it looks like he's minded to destroy his creation, he decides instead not to destroy his creation, but to decide again on a reset. And he looks around for somebody to implement it. Casts his eyes around, and who does he find? He finds Noah. Noah is deemed to be the only one righteous enough, it says, to find favour. Just to stop and think about that for a moment. He finds favour. That doesn't say that Noah did it all by his own efforts, but actually this is maybe one of the earliest moments we see God's grace coming into play. So what caused those floods in Noah's time? Well, the earth has heated and cooled over many millennia, and actually floods were a natural part of the cycle in that part of the world. But were they influenced by humans, as ours are probably today? Well, human beings trod so much more lightly on the earth that I think that man-made and environmental causes can be discounted in the floods of Noah's time. The wickedness that grieved God in the time of Noah was about many things that were related to human behaviour then. But it's not about the human use of the environment. But what about when we look at us? When we look back over the last couple of centuries, and particularly if we look at the last couple of decades, what do we see? We see really that as people we have not trodden lightly upon the earth. And actually we've trodden so heavily that we're on the point of destroying the ecosystems that govern the climate of the earth. It's thoughtlessness, wantonness, and actually, in our terms, sinful destruction of the environment which has brought us to this point. And our use of our resources has already done irreparable damage to the world. So unlike the floods of Noah's time, the responsibility for the environmental catastrophes that we witness now does sit squarely on our shoulders and on those who have gone particularly just before us. The situation is a consequence of our collectively, not just one of us, our collectively ruinous behaviour in a world that we know as Christian people is already fallen and broken in all kinds of ways. But let's think about Noah, the obedience of Noah. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? As in the story, we see that God gives Noah very precise instructions about what needs to happen in order to ensure the survival of human beings and all the species of the known world, including his sons, who will be the starting point of a new beginning. But did you note this? This is the one thing that stands out to me. Noah responds straight away. He does exactly what God instructs him to do. And as a result, into the ark we can see here, go all of his family, all of the animals, all of the foodstuffs, and everything necessary for the ark to rise with the water and survive the flood. This week I found myself wondering, God, have you given us instructions on what to do in our present emergency? Well, God may have spoken to a modern day Noah, I really don't know about that. But these days, and in our fellowship groups, we often discuss how God speaks to us, how God reveals himself to us. And we've come to know that there are many ways that God does exactly that. Some of them are personal, but sometimes God speaks to us through the agencies of others. And in our age, and in matters of climate, we have gifted and dedicated scientists who can monitor what's happening in our planet and advise the actions that need to be taken. But the problem is not one of knowing what to do. The problem is one of heed not being taken. So we need to note this one thing well. Noah took decisive and practical action. When God spoke, what did he do? He started building the ark immediately. And I've imagined this week how different the story might have been if Noah, when God had spoke to him, had delayed for a very long while, if he'd pursued important business first, if he'd talked to governments first, or if he'd even pretended that there was no possibility that the flood was ever going to happen. And I thought too that our human story might be looking very different in this moment if we'd actually listened to climate scientists over the last decade and taken some action together. But what about this covenant relationship? Environmentally, the prognosis for the climate does seem pretty bleak at the moment. But what about that special relationship between God and mankind? One commentator I read this week remarked that it's interesting that in the time of Noah, God does not completely destroy the earth and start again. And at the end of the flood, he gives a rainbow, which is not just a pretty phenomenon. It's actually a bow, and it's a sign, it's hanging upside down in the sky, that God has hung up his bow and ceased to war with mankind at the end of that time. Those of us who follow Jesus know that God did far more than hanging up his bow. When he sent Jesus to die on the cross and rise again, it signalled an end to the control of sin in the world because Jesus stood in as a sacrifice. And with his resurrection and the promise of forgiveness to all who repent, we found that we had a restored relationship with God in a new covenant, not one made with one person, but one available to all who believe. And this actually gives us choices as we sit here as a group of Christian people in a faith community. about how actually we as individual people conduct ourselves in the world. Paul tells us in Romans 8 and verse 5 that those who are dominated by sinful nature think about sinful things, and those who are controlled by the Holy Spirit think about things that please the Spirit. And I think that thinking about that which pleases the Spirit of God in this business of environmental care is a start. But thoughts, as we know, need to translate into actions in order to make a practical difference. So where does that leave us? We are part of the problem in our lifestyles and maybe even our attitudes to climate change. Damage has been done that we probably can't reverse, and we will share the consequences like everyone else. But is God just sitting back? That's what I'm asking myself. Is God sitting back just to let us struggle? But I don't believe so. The headlines are written large. We've seen some of them in the pictures today. And some of those pictures are truly apocalyptic, aren't they? The Greek ones in particular. But we do have that hope that everything will ultimately be restored through Jesus. And I do think there are signs of hope and signs of a new order. And remember that Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven in many different ways, really, but one was as a mustard seed, a tiny little seed that grows to the most enormous plant. And then he talked about the kingdom of heaven as yeast, permeating dough and making a loaf rise right through. And I think there are one or two things happening that are a bit like that. We live in an area where lots of people are farmers. And I've been very interested reading in the paper over the last week or two about regenerative practices in farming. And here in the UK, it started with just a very few farmers. And the last convention of people practicing these different ways of farming attracted about 5,000 or 6,000 people. And it's seen all over Europe, certainly. I read about an olive farmer who had stopped taken his tractor between the rows of trees in his olive grove to take off the vegetation and just let the vegetation grow. And what did he find? Rather than the vegetation choking the trees, he found that in the drier climate, the vegetation sucked up and retained the moisture and made like a bed, a moist bed. And lo and behold, what happened? His trees didn't dry up. His trees, one, were better nourished with water and also actually produced more and better olives than they'd done before. I think it's an amazing lesson. Another news story that's fascinated me this week is the what they call the plastic sphere floating out in the ocean. Did you know that out in the ocean there is a plastic land that is the size of France? It's our bottles, you know, all those pet bottles that we dump out at sea when we think we've recycled them and get sent somewhere else. They found that in the plastisphere, organisms have started to develop themselves that can digest plastic. And they're bringing them back now to using waste management. But more than that, they found that other creatures have started to adapt and to make one of those sort of pyramids of life on the plastisphere that is starting to adapt and become a floating land. And I'm sure that if we delved, and debated whether this is going to hold off or not, but let's just get to the end of this, then maybe we'll go inside. There are lots of things which are adapting, but the key thing is this: Noah took action, and through him God enabled a reset of the earth. and made a covenant. And Jesus came with a new covenant, not just for one man or one nation, but one available to the whole world. So that is why I truly believe that a reset of the earth is possible again if we take the action God is asking of us now.
Holy Spirit,